It's 6:33. We'll give it to about 6:35, and then we'll jump in, and I'll try to do a multiple screen thing and see if there's anything that comes on Facebook question wise. We'll always open up. So the basic format is we'll do, everybody does their, go over, call everybody's name, do your 1 minute introduction. We'll jump straight into the questions. Everybody doesn't have to answer every question, but kind of what speaks to you. And then after that, we'll open up for other folks to have questions as well. And then we'll do what we need to do. So people are populating, so we'll give everybody another minute or so. All right, everybody, it's 6:35. So once again, my name is Chaplain Trevor Buford, and I'm the interim college chaplain here at Trinity College. And we are super excited tonight, in light of everything that's happening in the world, to welcome you, tremendous scholars and leaders, to our conversation around peace. We know that in light of all the challenges and all the changes, thinking about what it means to have personal peace and to have a peaceful community, or to seek community peace, is a critical conversation that we need to be having. And more importantly, we don't want to just talk about peace, but we want to talk about what it means to seek peace, and from a variety of different faith perspectives, and from a variety of different perspectives from how we approach this concept, both in community and personally. So the first thing I want to do is welcome those who are streaming on Facebook, those who are in our Zoom room with us. A couple of ground rules. If you're in the Zoom room with us, please make sure that you have your feedback muted, your microphone muted. If you want to ask a question, if you raise your hand, Chloe, who from the chapel office, will be doing the questions, and she will bring those in. You can also put the questions in the chat if you want to direct them directly at a particular one of our scholars that are here who will introduce themselves. Other than that, we actually keep it on mute just to avoid any feedback that we may have. But other than that, we're going to have a robust conversation. And each of our panelists will speak for 2 or 3 minutes on the different questions we have ahead of time, but then we will open it up for a conversation, which is what we really want to be about, which is talking together in light of what it means for us to seek peace. So the first thing that's going to happen is each of our panelists will take a moment to introduce themselves to you and tell a little bit of who they are, and really the faith perspective and also personal perspective they represent. So I will start with our Rabbi Andy Flegel. Did I hear right?
Hi, I'm Andy Flegel. I am one of the rabbis at Congregation Beth Israel in West Hartford. And Chaplain Buford, was that it? Sorry, did you just want me to introduce myself?
Yeah, introduce yourself, and we'll go through the questions in a minute. Yes.
Okay.
Nahal Khan.
Hi, everyone. How you doing? My name is Nihal Khan. I am the Director of Religious Affairs at the Islamic Center of Connecticut in Windsor, Connecticut. I graduated from the Hartford Seminary, and just active in the greater Hartford area and trying to build better relations and get people to talk to each other as opposed to at each other.
That's tough these days. All right. Dr. Willie Francois.
Hello, I'm Willie Dwayne Francois III, Senior Pastor of the Mount Zion Baptist Church in Pleasantville, New Jersey. I am also, I run a theological think tank that is interested in progressive policy advocacy, and I am an assistant professor of liberation theology at New York Theological Seminary.
Dr. Junius Johnson.
Hello, everyone. I'm Junius Johnson. I'm a theologian working primarily in the Catholic tradition, and I am an independent scholar, do a lot of research on, my work is in philosophical articulations of Christian doctrines.
Garrett Condon.
Good evening. I'm Garrett Condon. I'm Associate Chaplain for Buddhist Life at Trinity College. I've been with my colleague, John Elias. We have been conducting Zen practice at Trinity College for more than 20 years. I'm a 30-year student of Buddhism. I've been a Dharma teacher at the New Haven Zen Center for 20 plus years. And I've had, my day jobs have been 30 years as a newspaper journalist and a decade and a half in healthcare policy and communication.
So as you can tell, we definitely have a dynamite panel. We probably need to have this over like 3 days of conversations that we could have with all these scholars in the room. We'll do our best to limit it to 3 minutes apiece, but I know that's going to be tough when we talk about it. So I'll start with the first question, and I will just direct it and if to anybody who wants to start off with it, and then we'll move around from there. And the first question really is when we think about this word peace, can you kind of define it both linguistically, but also from your faith perspective, and really kind of give that perspective to the conversation about kind of when you think about the word peace, kind of what it means both linguistically and from your personal faith perspective. So I'll start off with Dr. Johnson, and then we'll move around.
Sure. So, yeah, you almost want to have Rabbi Fluegel go first because it's really the notion of shalom that is at the jumping off point, even for the Christian tradition. And it's funny, we get a lot of folks say, oh, shalom is this rich word, it has all these meanings, and then they go on to say whatever they want to say that it means. From my reading of the Hebrew scriptures, as well as the ways in which the Hebrew scriptures were read by Jesus and by the apostles in the New Testament, what we're really talking about when we come at that concept of shalom is wholeness, integralness. And from the standpoint of the Christian tradition, this has got to be bidirectional. On the one hand, a person cannot be, if a person's to be whole, then they're going to be what they're meant to be, what they were created to be, what God's vision of them is to be. And a person cannot be that if the person doesn't have integrity in their relationship to God and integrity in their relationship to neighbor. And so both of those pieces play into what it looks like, what constitutes this peace that the Apostle Paul says is a peace that surpasses or transcends understanding. The way that I think that the surpassing understanding is an important part of the Christian notion of peace, I think, precisely because the reason it surpasses understanding is it's really a peace that belongs to another world. We're not, according to our way of thinking of things, we're not ever going to be in this world completely who we're meant to be. We're always on that journey towards becoming who we're meant to be. And so that final realization of ourselves comes on the other side of this life, comes when things have been consummated by Christ in his glory. That's where that peace truly belongs. But that peace is accessible to us in this world now by a sort of, we call it in theology, proleptic participation. It's something that belongs to the time of glory that's available here. It's not available in a fragmentary way because the things of God don't get divided, but our possession of it here is only fragmentary. And so you could think of it almost as something from another dimension that's extruding into our dimension, that's putting in an appearance. And we have a connection to that, and it's given to us as a gift. The giftedness of it is very important. And then it's something that we have to grow into. It becomes a directionality towards our life. And I think that we can unpack some more of what that directionality looks like, especially in the context of society and the individual as we consider the other questions.
Rabbi Fluegel, I think he kind of tossed it up to you to go next and to give us the history behind the words. I'll defer to you next, Rabbi Fluegel.
Sure. So Well, you stole my line a little bit, Dr. Johnson. But just like we heard, shalom is inherently tied to the word shalem. So shalom, which means peace, is inherently tied to this word, the same root, the same beginning, shalem, which means wholeness. And that wholeness is not a kind of perfection. It's rather an acknowledgement that all of us have our brokenness and all of us have our many different parts, our many different pieces, but seeking to finding peace in that is in and of itself a kind of a wholeness. So I, as a rabbi, as a Jewish person, I am a member of the people of the book. I brought a whole bunch of texts. And one of them is, might be familiar to a lot of us from the book of Ecclesiastes, that talks about there is a season for everything, and a time for weeping, and a time for laughing, a time for wailing, and a time for dancing. And this litany concludes with a time for war and a time for peace. So while we are in a pursuit for peace, and it could be argued that the basis of the entire foundation of Jewish learning and Jewish living is in pursuit of that peace, coupled with the pursuit for justice, that they really cannot be separated. There's this acknowledgement that in the world that we live in, all of these things are constantly ongoing. All of these different kinds of moments, all of these different ways of being. And they're also constantly ongoing within ourselves as individuals. And as we kind of keep studying through the text of the Hebrew Bible, Isaiah gives us this amazing vision of a world where all shall beat their swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. A nation shall not take up sword against nation, and they shall never again know war. And this beautiful, peaceful world that we can imagine without any war is followed. This vision of this world is followed by an instruction to follow the teachings of Torah, to follow God's ways. And what are those ways? What is this pathway? It is one that pursues righteousness and justice. So one last text that I'll just open with comes from the Talmud, which is a post-biblical text. It says, the world is maintained by three things. By justice, by truth, and by peace. Another rabbi said, these three are actually one. If justice is present, then truth is present, and this makes peace. Wherever there is justice, there will be peace. And wherever there is peace, there will be justice. So we both have this reality of the world that we're in, this acknowledgement that we are in a world that has suffering, that our own lives will go through periods of more hope and more peace and periods of more suffering. And sometimes those things are happening within us all the time. Like for many of us, that's so true right now. And that is also paired with this vision of what the world could be, what this world could be when we are all on this path of working towards rectifying the wrongs all around us, this path of justice that is inherently intertwined with a path of peace.
I'm going to go to Nahal Khan from the Islamic Center. Will you speak to, from your faith perspective, what it means for us to seek personal and community peace?
Yeah, I think from the Islamic tradition at a personal level and at a communal level, there's a couple of ways to understand how the idea of peace is brought up. To the rabbi's point, the word in Arabic in the Islamic tradition for peace is salam, which does connect to the Hebrew word of shalom. And that's not a coincidence because as people of the book, people who are Jews or Christians or Muslims, there's obviously that Abrahamic tie that brings us all together. Specifically, though, when it comes to the aspect of peace, the word salam is actually the same root that is used to describe the faith of Islam, right? So it's the same exact root. But often people will say that, okay, well, peace comes from a place, or Islam comes from a place of peace, which is there, but more so it comes from a place of submission, submitting to something that is a higher power than myself, submitting to something beyond me or something beyond what I just believe to be an all essence way of living. It's about submitting to God. It's about submitting to something greater than myself at the end of the day. And in bringing the community into that, it's about making the community also understand that if we are going to do something within the community, if we're going to teach something, if we're going to be in the service of others, we're doing that not for ourselves, but to build a relationship with our creator, number one. And then number two, understanding that when we have embodied a sense of sincerity, not just a pure transactional form of piety in which we're increasing our good deeds and decreasing our bad deeds, but rather we're working for a greater cause for the pleasure of our creator, that begins to set itself into place where people then are able to go away from being a very egotistical community. And it also goes back to this point where one of the names of God, often in Arabic, will refer to God as Allah, but Allah is actually, if you go to, let's say, Maronite Christians in Lebanon, they'll also utilize the name Allah. If you go to any groups in the Middle East who are monotheistic, they'll utilize that name, which literally means the God. But one of the names of God that is utilized in Islam is that God is known as As-Salam, which is the source of peace, the start of peace, the end of peace. So one of the prayers, the supplications that we're taught to say after one of our 5 daily prayers in the Sunni tradition is that, oh God, you are peace, and from you peace emanates. So we actually say that after every single one of the 5 prayers within the Sunni tradition. And then on top of that, what we understand is that a sense of peace and a sense of tranquility is rooted when we can not use spirituality to transcend the world, but use spirituality to access the world, right? And that's what we have to really understand. It's not about disconnecting, it's about reconnecting. And it goes back to a tradition from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in which he said that a believer who is connected to the community and connected to the affairs of the community is better than a believer who just completely cuts themselves off and completely goes into reclusion and seclusion and doesn't concern himself or herself with the affairs of the community. And I think personally, I very much so identified, with that aspect. And when we get into discussions about justice and peace, that also goes hand in hand, right? It's not about simply being oppressed and saying, let my oppressor oppress me, but rather it's about finding that sense of balance that's rooted within all of our traditions.
Garrett, do you want to speak from your perspective on this idea of peace, both personal and communal?
Sure. First of all, this idea of spirituality connecting with the world really has some resonance in Zen Buddhist practice. Buddhism began as one person's quest to deal with suffering and find peace. So I'm afraid that in the West, somehow, there's an idea that it's just all about meditation somehow. And obviously the Buddha's awakening story, which I think is familiar to most people, starts as this kind of meditation experience. But when he expounds his discovery through his awakening, he talks about the four noble truths. One is the truth of suffering, that suffering is in our lives. Now, sometimes this is misunderstood in that somehow Buddha Buddhism thinks that life is, a complete drag, total suffering. It's really about the truth of suffering. It's about that suffering is something that we live with, okay? The cause of suffering being desire, the promise of a way to deal with this, and finally the Eightfold Path, which is really a kind of recipe for happiness in Buddhism, and it's a very foundational doctrine, if you want to call it that. So the interesting thing about the Eightfold Path is that there are 8 elements to it: right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right meditation. 2 of them deal with meditation. Everything else is how we act in the world. Okay, so right action is, how can I help this world? Right thought is, am I overtaken by my opinions, my habitual thinking, whatever it is that helpful? Right livelihood is, what I'm doing for work helping the world? So a good deal of, most of the Eightfold Path is dealing with behavior, and it grounds it in some kind of meditation practice. And these are very, very fundamental to, I think, across the board in a variety of Buddhist practices. And my root teacher, who was a Korean monk named Sung-san, he had a kind of shorthand for this for Westerners. He'd say, Zen is about understanding your mind and helping other people. And that is a kind of encapsulation of the Eightfold Path. So peace begins with wisdom and practice. Ideally, it leads to wise, compassionate action in the world. And communities built on that are accepting, open, strong, adaptable. That's kind of the Buddhist vision of peace, individually and communally.
Finally, Dr. Francois, your perspective, unique perspective on communal and personal peace from your perspective.
Sure. And I too, as 3 of our other panelists, come from these Abrahamic traditions as a self-identified, well, not quite a self-identified Christian, but definitely a self-identified follower of Jesus. That I think it is also always important for thinking about peace as the kind of categorical opposite of imperialism. I think that as even when we think about Paul centering and enacting ideas around peace, that it happens in the context of a totalizing imperialism that he benefits from to some extent, but ultimately leads to his demise. That there is an idea of peace that stands in opposition to the Pax Romana, the Pax Americana. This idea of peace that stands as a corrective to the way structures and systems have a way of swallowing human potential and human flourishing. And so, even thinking about the concept of shalom as we have talked about today, is that there has to be this radical connection to connection of peace to justice, but not this kind of vacuous, empty way of thinking about justice, but really thinking about justice as a redistribution of power and a redistribution of material resources that actually avails radical mutuality, right? Because it is about wholeness. It is about sufficiency. But in order for wholeness and sufficiency to be true, there are aspects of our material condition, our material world, that must be checked, that must be upended, that must be disrupted. And so I think the only thing that I could add is that thinking about a type of justice, thinking about a peace that is connected to the radical redistribution of power and the radical redistribution of resources, that actually affords some sense of self-sufficiency and enoughness, a type of redistribution of resources and redistribution of power that actually does create the space for radical mutuality, because peace is not possible, personal or social, communal, if there is hegemonic forces at work. If racism is at work, if sexism is at work, if homophobia is at work, it inherently compromises the possibility for peace. And so without this I guess I'm offering a kind of structuralist, maybe post-structuralist way of thinking about peace that allows us to one, honor the fact that human life is actually vulnerable to system structures and power, and to be clear that I cannot get to that place of personal flourishing and personal accountability without the checking and possibly most often the dismantling of structures of power that privilege that privilege some groups over other groups, that privilege some communities over some other communities, that privilege certain aspects of life over other aspects of life. And so I think that there has to be a serious reimagining of what the material and particularly what the material and what the power dynamics of a particular community are for peace to exist. And I imagine it's Dr. King that says, peace is the presence of justice, but it's a matter of teasing out what is this, what do we mean by justice? And I can only offer by justice is this radical redistribution of resources, radical redistribution of power that actually affords a real sense of mutuality.
Wow, various perspectives all coming back to the same thing, and I appreciate each of that. So I'm gonna skip straight to like the fourth question about like, what do you see are the challenges that we have faced in our current times to this idea of peace, both communal and personal? People are watching, and students and faculty members are logging on saying, it's been a challenging time, right, for people, and I threw up this idea of peace for people to wrestle with it. So from your perspective, think about like the biggest challenges we faced to this idea of communal and personal peace, and how do you suggest that people address those challenges as their communal and personal peace may have or may not have been interrupted? And I won't make presumptions about that. So I will start with Brother Khan, and then we'll move around from there. And if you guys want to, if someone says something, you want to kind of jump in, maybe let them breathe and then unmute yourself and slide in, it's fine, to keep the conversation robust. So we'll start with Nahal Khan.
Are we basically talking about practicing peace, right, within a...
Well, we're really talking about like, how has the current crisis in our world been challenging the pursuit of peace? Yeah. What have we been living in that's really challenged that pursuit? And then go into, and if you want to move into some practices, that's also fine as well. We're kind of combining two questions into one.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think things that do present themselves to be barriers, I think it starts with representation, is that are we bringing about marginalized voices in our community to the table? Because there's often this this discussion about, we have to be at the table, but we don't talk about like, well, if you're at the table, are you there as a guest, or are you there as an item on the menu, right? Or are you there as somebody that, that is just gonna just be there for the sake of tokenism? But are we actually achieving a sense of representing communities that need to be, represented? Number two, bordering on issues related to intolerance and fascism, without listening to each other, as I'd mentioned. There's often a culture of people talking at each other. And I think we're not actually listening to each other, which presents to be a problematic an issue within the community in general, whether that's within our own faith group, whether that's within an outside faith group. But at the end, when we aren't listening to people and we're not letting them feel represented, what we're doing is taking away and erasing that aspect, right? As a person of color, as a person who's South Asian, when somebody says like, I don't see color, I'm like, I don't want you to say that. I want you to see my color. I want you to see exactly who I am for what I am. and not just get lost in talking about things at a political level, at a macrocosm, but talking about things within the microcosm. There may be a lot of issues, and I think a lot of young people will, get very riled up about social justice or get riled up about things that are happening around across the country, which is good. But I think it's also helpful to address the microcosm. What does your community look like? Where you live right now, what are the problems that people are facing? And then when you involve yourself to that degree, and then you begin to branch out, where are areas that people are struggling or young people are struggling to connect with their communities? And when I say community, like I said, I'm not just saying the faith community, but just the general community. And then where can they learn to agree? And then where can they also learn to disagree and just kind of work around that? And I think because of not just within America, but the United States in general, or the whole world in general, it does seem like it's a bit more of a polarizing place than it was some years ago, right? When many of you, including myself, were perhaps growing up. And how do we go about combating that? Living at the time of COVID-19, where people are stuck in their houses and there are issues related to one's mental health, which would be a road which will cut them off from having a sense of peace, right? Like we're seeing divorce rates necessarily skyrocket. We're seeing, I'm sure many of you that are within a capacity of pastoral care, you're getting more issues coming up within families, and families need counseling. And we, as the first responders, can only take so much. But I think just getting into the place where, yes, people are hurting, and how can we see past their pain, past the words that they may say, which may be painful, and see what is the actual hurt within themselves, and where is that sourcing itself from? And I think as leaders, that's our duty, is to look at that pain of that single person, of that individual human being, and address that pain for what it is, and commit ourselves not to a result, but commit ourselves to a process, to helping people resolve that pain at an individual level. I think that's very important for us to kind of grow from and grow on.
So Dr. Johnson, your perspective, we got this idea of peace, and then we got our current cultural context. How do we put our idea of personal community peace inside of that? And what are the challenges that we're facing?
As I articulated, my understanding of peace, it's got a bidirectionality, right? And so the challenge to that is going to come from two directions as well. On the one hand, it's important not to hear the Christian tradition saying that everything is about your relationship with God and nothing else matters. That would be a distortion of the Christian message. At the same time, it's very true for the Christian tradition that if that relationship with God isn't going in the right direction, if there isn't significant work being done there under the rubric of what we call sanctification, then the other relationships, even if they look like they're doing well, are not going to be productive of this peace that we're talking about. A peace that passes understanding is a transcendent peace. It's a peace that comes from somewhere other than the realm of things that we can get our head around and understand. But it comes from that realm to address that realm. So on the one hand, I think a lot of our current obstacles to peace are the things that directly attack our sense of devotion and well-being with relation to the divine. Anything that would produce a theodicy type question, a problem of evil question, how could a good God let X happen, is an assault on our peace. It's not to be, assaults on our peace have to be taken seriously. Just to say that it's an assault on our peace you can't conclude, well, peace is what I want, so if this is assaulting my peace, I can just reject that. I don't want to ask those questions. I don't want them to arise. No, those are the questions you have to face directly if you're going to be able to recover your peace, right? But there's a way in which we're drawn away from the divine towards the mess that we see down here. And a lot of times, problem of evil, the question of how could a good God let X, Y, or Z happen down here, is in many ways a strategy that attacks our perspective. The recognition that peace, justice, truth, to take Rabbi Fliegel's words, that these things are being worked at the transcendent level by the God who is the source of all peace, to take Nihal's words, right? And so there's something, those things are all going to begin with the work that God is doing, and then they're going to be applied to the world through God's people in the world. And that's the second prong of the attack on peace, is the attack on the love of neighbor. Because one of the temptations that I think we've all felt in these last several trying months has been a temptation to sort of turn inward into ourselves. Gosh, I'm so cut off. I'm so alone. I'm feeling so vulnerable. I can't take all these things that are happening in the world. And then there comes a need to sort of tend to the self, right? And sort of elevate self-care. Well, the self is really important in the Christian tradition. How can you love your neighbor as yourself if you don't love your neighbor? If you don't love yourself, I mean to say, right? It presupposes, the second commandment that Jesus underscores presupposes that you love yourself. So that's important. But at the end of the day, the Christian message is so directed at the neighbor. It's about the Samaritan who stops along the road and who is careless of his responsibilities and where he needs to be and how much money he has and whatnot, because the need of his neighbor injured on the road before him places a claim on him that he can't walk away from. That becomes the most important thing in his day, regardless of what he thought was going to be important getting up. So there's a temptation away from the love of neighbor, which can ironically look like the championing of causes, which can blind us to the particular neighbor in front of us, and especially can blind us to the neighbor who's on the other side of the cause that we're fighting for, where they become the problem, they become a villain, they become a thing that's got to be overcome. If we can just beat them, if we can just elect the right person, then everything's going to be okay because we'll win. Well, but your neighbor sitting on the other side of that question, the problem is that something is going on in his heart that makes him see the world such that what he is most excited about is the thing that you think is our biggest problem, right? So I think that just to sort of summarize that, there's a way in which the love of neighbor can become an excuse and a temptation drawing us away from the love of God, which has to be in place first. And then the love of self, which is preconditioned for the love of neighbor, can be a temptation or an excuse drawing us away from the love of neighbor. And the real challenge to peace, as especially the Catholic tradition that I spend most of my time reflecting, the challenge to peace always comes in not choosing among these three loves, but in making sure that you keep them properly ordered. It's the disordering of the love that is the danger that we face. And that's when we become the agents of unpeace in the world, whether that looks like war, strife, oppression, or whatever.
That is Francois. I'll move on to you, your perspective.
Yeah, I think that there is, I often remix Reinhold Niebuhr. He says this about democracy. I think about this in terms of peace, right? It's humanity's capacity for evil that makes peace necessary, and it's our inclination towards some good, some justice that actually makes peace possible. I think that what we're really wrestling with is this deep paradox of what it means to be human, this deep crisis of what it means to be human. The capacity to build, create, also lends itself to the capacity to destroy and demean. And I think from those limitations, some of those inclinations, I think there is a predatory individualism and also a mythic superiority that often just lives within our shores, lives within our body politic. And the hardest thing to achieving the dismantling of that is this inability to shed privilege, whether that is racial privilege, class privilege, citizenship privilege, whether it is gender privilege. It is this inability to shed privilege. And to me, it feels like one of the crises of humanity and one of the hurdles to achieving peace is we are really bereft of a moral imagination, the capacity to see beyond and construct a world beyond the observable experiences, a way to really reach into, a way I think about what Dr. Johnson is talking about, this sort of cosmic oughtness, this way the world should be, that lives, that transcends the way things are, that is rooted in a sense of the sacred and rooted in a sense of a type of intimacy that is ontological in some way. Is we've been disabused by this world of that kind of imagination that allows us to see beyond what we observe. And so there has to be, in terms of shaping this imagination, there has to be a way to envision humanity as a web of relations. There has to be a way of mining beneath the surface of the suffering and the death and the destruction that has become so normal in our world. There has to be a way for us to still believe and surrender to the full range of creativity that is human being, that gives us an appetite for the mysterious, the new, the unseen, the impossible, right? We need a passion for the possible. And I think that our inability to have this moral imagination lends us to this inability to shed our privilege, which gives us which leaves us with this inability to really dismantle this predatory individualism and mythic superiority that is real. And I think that, and part of this is connected to our own, particularly the religious context that I live most closely to, is that there is this kind of escapist messianism, right? Like, we're all waiting for someone else to do it for us. We're all waiting for some political messiah, some moral messiah to show up and handle this for us. And we don't seem to have the kind of imagination to believe in our own sufficiency to handle our problems. We don't have the imagination to believe that we are the ones that we're actually looking for. And I think the inability to see ourselves as the ones we're looking for is directly connected to this reluctance to shed power and shed privilege.
We're going to move to Rabbi Flegel, but I also just want to let people know that if you have a question or a comment or a way something you want to add to the conversation, Chloe is watching, who's managing the meeting, is watching the chat. And so please feel free to do that. And if you're streaming on Facebook, we're going out to try to monitor that as well to see if there are questions or responses to some of the ideas that our scholars are putting forward. So Rabbi Flegel.
So I've just been reflecting on two of the many, but major hindrances that I think, we've been experiencing societally and personally to experiencing peace. And thinking back to that Talmudic text that talks about the three things that the world stands on: justice, truth, and peace. We have, they're all so deeply complicated in their own ways. Truth has certainly been an ever more complicated one in recent years, but there's so many different ways to understand truth, right? And there's a difference between, as we know, right, like a statement of fact and all of the multiplicity of truths that exist just in this Zoom room based on all of our lived experiences and the ways that we all individually experience the world. And the revelation of so much truth and the sharing of so much truth that has been certainly ongoing and really but also has these moments of erupting, like did this summer, when so many people, like me, white people, were able at a different moment in time and place to hear so many truths about what it is like to be a person of color in this country. That third of the combination of justice and truth and peace is essential. So if that truth is is denied or ignored, then justice and peace are impossible. And it also, none of these things are there and lifted up as the things that the world stand on because they are easy or feel good. Because if they felt good, we would all be doing them. We wouldn't need these teachings. We wouldn't need these panels. And so while we might imagine peace as something that is simple and something that brings relief, it is, if it is inherently tied to justice and truth, then it is challenging. It challenges us both individually and as a community. And the other is just this immense fear of the unknown and the constant uncertainty that we've been living in some ways, chaotically for years, and then especially these past many months of the pandemic, and then this intensely grave way in this last week of the election.